Alright, I'm going to show you how to use AutoCAD to maybe start getting you going on the next part of the project, Project 1B. So I'm going to start a new drawing where typically we started through the templates here to make sure we're using a named plot style. I've set up my AutoCAD so that when I hit this button here, that's called the Q New button, it'll actually create a new drawing based on the correct template. By default, it does not. If you want to know how to do that, I posted a video in the software help section. It's just a 5-minute video on how to make that work. Alright, so first thing I'm going to do is just very quickly create a rectangle from the origin based on a dimension that is 7,000 by 3,000. So essentially our wall here. And I can zoom in. Okay, and what I might do is start making a couple layers, and I'll make them as I need them so we can move through it. So first I might just call this one, which we've already done some. Alright, so I'm going to make a new layer, call it outline, give it some value and a line weight, and then I'm going to create a second one. And this one I'm going to call, just for fun, grid lines. And I'm going to explain what this is. This is something I'm going to suggest maybe you add or think about. And what I'm going to do with grid lines is I'm now going to start playing with some line types. So I'm going to change this line type to, let's use a center line. And this is similar to what might be used for grid lines on an architectural drawing, but a little bit different. But it's just giving me a long dash and a short dash. But it'll give me something different to use there. And I don't want this to be a very thick line weight because it's just kind of a reference. Let me go 0.09. Alright, so that's what I'm going to set there. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this so we can work on this. I'll change this just by selecting it, moving this to the outline. And I actually want my grid lines to be current, so I'm going to select that. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to create a line at each end of the wall that will extend past it. So you can't really see it here, but I've created one, and I'm going to create one at the end here. I'm also, just for construction, going to create another line in between these. Now what I want is a number of divisions. So let's say I'm starting to think of my pattern as a transition from one section to another. I can use these divisions to help me start eyeballing or start getting an idea of where these transitions might happen. So what I want really, because I want a center of the wall and maybe 2 on each side, I want 5 divisions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's a nice easy way to do that. I can select the line, start typing divide, and that will allow me to divide this line with a number of segments. I'm going to say 5. Now what this does, it doesn't look like it did anything, but if I try to select here, you can see I've got these dots, these nodes, that allow me to make these lines. So I'm just going to take these lines that already exist and copy them over onto these nodes. Alright, so all I've really done, then erase this out, is created a division along the wall that I can begin to play with as a point of transition. You can divide yours into more or less, it's up to you. I don't necessarily, I want these lines to not be this big, and this is another trick. Right, what this is controlled with is the line type scale. So if you want these to be, in other words, if I want more dash in here, I can select the lines themselves and change, well, let's just change the whole document. By having nothing selected, I can change the scale to, in this case, 0.5. It's not going to work. Let's just select the lines, do 0.5, right, and you can see how it's adjusting the scale of that. Those lines there. Now you don't want to do this too often. You want it to kind of remain to where it's adjusting on its own, but sometimes you have to kind of force it to do it. But we've changed the actual object properties, meaning the objects themselves. So I've changed that for each individual object, not for the drawing as a whole. Although it looks like it's doing something there. Anyway, so let's kind of go back to that drawing that I made in the video. Alright, so it was based on, there were some rows that I wanted some openings, some voids to happen. So you could get mathematical about it, but for now I'm not. I'm just going to put in another layer. call this one diagram lines or something. All right, and this is just going to be a diagrammatic representation of what I'm thinking about, what I think might want to happen on this. I want this to be a solid line, continuous. It's just picking up my last, and I want it to be fairly thick in this case, just as a representation. So with those set, I'm just going to come in and essentially draw the line. Here's a trick, like if I'm trying to snap, I don't want it to snap there. If I know I want it to snap, one way is to pull the snaps here and pick what's called a nearest and just have that on all the time. Or I can just start typing in NEA. You can see it'll switch to that snap. Alright, so all I'm doing is just sort of generating a line of where I think I want this diagram to show, and you'll see how it builds up as I move along. So I'm going to change this back to diagram lines and make sure diagram lines is my current. Right. So I have that. I'm going to, let's say, offset this line, the distance from here to here, just so it's equal. So I'm going to do this a very tedious way, or you can actually just come in here and do an array or copy. Actually, I think copy is probably faster. So if I copy from here, I can just copy this up, snapping. Alright, and it might be that I've got these too close together right now for representation, which I do, so I'm just going to delete every other one. Alright, and I'm trying to do this without editing the video, so you can just get an understanding of how, you know, even I might work through a project like this. Just make 2 lines there, be very cautious of that. So you can get an understanding of how I use AutoCAD and to kind of think through the project. Right. If you wanted to be really smart and do this mathematically, it would probably make a little more sense. But I have these lines. I know that I want a gradation from one condition here, like we talked about, to another condition here. And right now they're all even. So what I might do is actually just start coming in here and just to randomize this a little bit. Start pulling these lines and to really kind of start dividing it up to a maximum and minimum. I know that's my maximum line. This might be my minimum. Just kind of move these lines in reference. Kind of randomly at this point. Get a gauge of how I might see these things transitioning along this wall. Be careful of the snaps because they're going to want to snap to things, but we can turn that off with F3, so now it won't actually snap to anything. If I want to leave a couple of those to its full extent. Alright, so I'm just aesthetically at this point just kind of picking and choosing some that are random, just break up this line. So what this is actually doing for me, as well as creating a different pattern from left to right, it's creating sort of a difference from top to bottom as well. All right, so just do one more movement here. And again, hopefully you guys understand that I do these very quickly on the video. You guys should have a lot more time and a lot more effort to move through these and make something a little bit different. So I'll take a look and I'll say, well, I don't really have, maybe not enough lines in that. I'll just kind of take one of these actually, move it back there. So you just kind of get this nice kind of random pattern. But it might be we are also trying to play with some curvature or something here, and you can begin to move this around. So essentially, again, I'm just trying to create a diagram that starts to represent, and we'll see how I'm going to play with this in a second, some of these lines. Now, if we want to do, and now I'll show you some AutoCAD tools. So in my video, I had a circle at the end of everything, which represented, is just a graphic representation of the end of the line. So I'm going to I'll repeat that, and then we'll do something else as well. So I'm going to make circles. Just making that. And then I'm going to do something else while I'm in here. I'm going to do another one called circle hatch. And you can never have enough layers. This allows you total control over everything. So at some point, like the circles, I don't want to be a thick line, just to be something thin. At some point, I can control the line weight and the coloration, we'll get to that hopefully, of all of these layers. So let's make the circles current. So I'm just going to come in here and at the end, whoops, turn on my snaps again with F3, and at the end of that line, just create a circle that's a representation. Probably a little bit too big, so I'll do it again, a little bit smaller, and erase that one. Alright, so what I'm going to do is also repeat this along all of those endpoints, but before I do that, I'm going to fill this in with a hatch. So I'm going to use a command called the hatch, which is here, or I type BH. I'll just click here, and I'm going to fill it solid. And in this case, we could just come in here. If I do pick points, you can see how it'll fill in, but sometimes those lines will cause a problem, so I'm going to use select and just have it use that geometry and fill that in, which is exactly what I want. And since it's a solid hatch, I don't need to change any scale or anything else. So I'm going to close that, and I'm going to change that circle to, I'm escaping, come home, and change that to the circle hatch. Alright, now I can select that as an object, start the copy command, and just quickly come to every end of these lines. And let's get that. Alright, so in essence at this point I have, once I do all of this, a representation of the wall, a close representation of the wall that I had in that elevation video. Too many snaps, see it trying to do too much. Sometimes you can have too many snaps, so it helps to take them off. Alright, so hopefully I have all of that there. Alright, so let's just say I wanted to use this as a diagram, and let's go ahead and try to print it. That way I can get through a few things. So I'm just going to set this like I have before, to DWG to PDF. Just for now, I'm going to set this to A4. I'm going to plot a window. I don't care about the scale because it's just a diagram. And let it scale to the paper and apply it to the layout so I won't have to repeat all that. Alright, so now we can see it's just taking that information at face value, printing to colors. So you should know how to change this by now. I can come back in here and I'll just select all of these layers and put this to full saturation because we're using the AEC standard here. Going back to print and preview, we can see that I now have black lines. So these are thicker, these are actually about the same. I don't have my ground line, which I keep telling you guys to put in there, so I'll put that in. I'll just create one sort of randomly at this point. Pull it back out. Make a new layer. Ground. Color that I want. And some thickness. In this case, probably about 0.4. My diagram lines are there. I want to take my outline down just a hair. And I'm just basing this on the look that I saw. And then change this to the ground, of course. Alright, so let's take a quick peek at that. Alright. So that's what I have. So what I want is I want these diagram lines to be more dominant than the outline. I just want the outline to be a representation. I could even begin to number these so I have some sort of system in place. However you want to make this diagram is you can do whatever you want with it. Alright, so what I'm going to show you right now is, let's say I want those circles to print in red. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to want to do is change my circle hatch color to the color that I want it to be on the screen. In this case I want it to be red. And because these will outline it, I can make those red as well. Either that, or I can turn the printable part off and it'll just print the hatch. That's fine. But while I'm in here, what I also want to do is change it from full saturation back to normal. So by going back to normal, we're telling it to print in color. So should be that only my red dots are printing in color, which they are. So this is the beauty of the named plot styles. They can begin to allow you to make changes very quickly. And I'll make another video at some point on how to actually start altering the plot style table. So let's say I wanted the circles were a little bit too bright. I think I could be able to come in here and say 50%, and let's see if that works in color. I think it does. Yeah, so it's printing at 50% of the red in color. So there's a screening with that. So let's take it back. Go back here. I want to put these back to full saturation because I want them to be black. Actually, I'm going to end up turning them off because I'm going to show you something else. So let's make a new layer called rectangles. And I just thought of this as I was making these videos as a way to maybe start showing you how to do some other diagrams. So I'm going to make that current, and I'm going to turn off the circles because I don't really want those anymore. This is another version of the circle. Alright, so with that layer created, because I don't really want to mess this one up, let's just make a copy of it for now because it's essentially free to do this sort of stuff in AutoCAD. Alright, and I'm going to change these lines in here to my rectangle layer. And now I'm just going to offset this just some distance. I'm just going to make it up right about there. So what I actually did, I want to, the trick is just offset, and by default it's what's called through a point. It just lets you figure out a distance. You can just draw it or type it in, but here I'm just kind of eyeballing it, so now I know I want it to be that distance. I'm just going to come through all my lines and offset them down, and hopefully this will make sense at some point. And because it's all the same dimension, like I could make a rectangle, and I started to do that before I stopped the video and edited it, but it didn't really help. Right, so now I have this line. I'll create a small line here. It's much faster to copy than to click twice for a line. So since they're all offset the same size, I can quickly come through and copy this to the end of them. Alright. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to have to probably, oops, I don't want that. I just made an extra one, that's all. So copy this last one. Right. Alright, with that finished, what I want to do is use a gradient hatch in each of these, but because of the way I made them and the way the hatch works, I can pick inside of a boundary and it will fill it, or I can actually pick an object and it will fill that object. But since I only made these as three-sided objects, I can't use clicking an object, so I need to fill it in. But if I leave these lines on and I try to fill it in, it's going to fill each one of these individually. So I'm going to come back up here and turn my grid lines off. That way when I fill this hatch, and you'll see it work, it won't get stuck on those other lines. So I'm going to go to the hatch, and I'm going to use, instead of a solid, a gradient. And these are by default. I'm going to go from black to white. Alright, that way. And I'm going to use this cylinder one, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to pick points. So you can see as I hover in here, it's actually filling these with a gradient. Right? So what I'm doing is actually getting these to represent sort of a pattern that I'm thinking about in my head, or one similar to the wall that we've already looked at. Alright, but this is a nice way to diagrammatically begin to represent your ideas. So this is something that you could use on your presentation to show the ideas, plus it's going to be a starting point for working through some of these ideas. So you can see it's trying to center that. It's actually, I think, centering the whole gradient. That's interesting. Alright, so because I've selected each one of these as its own gradient, it's using the bounding box of that hatch as a gradient. That's not what I want. Unfortunately, what that means is I have to come in here, back to gradient, same settings, and pick one at a time. So I'm just hitting enter. Oh no. Alright. Let me show you, hopefully. Let's see if another command works. So I'm going to start the hatch on this as well. I want to pick there. And let's just see if it works. So another command you might be able to use, let me grab that. It's the match command. By typing MA, it'll match properties. And you can hopefully see if I click it, right? Yes. So it's taking the properties of that gradient and matching it. So in the end, this will be much easier than you think. Just going to let these fill up. And you can use match properties on anything. So it's very rare that I'm actually switching or changing layer properties through the layers. I'm just matching it to another layer that's already drawn on the screen. Oh, this is what's going on. My snap here is on, stopping me. Alright, so now I can select this, type MA for match properties. Oops. Make sure we get the right command, MA match properties. Well, I just did the exact same thing, didn't I? Anyway, I'm going to pause the video and come back. Okay, now I have the gradient all filled in like I want. Let's take a quick peek at what it might look like if I print it. If I do a preview, alright, it's got my previous wall, so I want to come back in and hit window again. Select the window around this wall and then hit preview. Alright, so it's giving me the gradient, but it's giving me a black outline, which is probably not what I want. And I can't really do much about that right now because they're both on the same layer. So what I would have to do is come back in here, make a new layer called something like rectangle hatch, let's call it. Color doesn't matter, just leave it as it is. And now I have to come in and select all the hatches. Much easier from closer. And change them to that layer, to the hatch layer. And then I can turn off the rectangle layer. And when I go to print, I won't get that outline. So come here, rectangle hatch, come back here, and turn off rectangles. Yes, I know it's the current layer, it's fine. So let's take a quick look at what it would look like if we printed. Preview again, wrong window. New window there, preview. I left frames on. Trying to rush through this too quickly, turn the rectangles off. Alright. Print again, but because I didn't say apply to layout, it's not going to remember that last one. So let's do that so I don't have to keep doing that. And there we go. So now we're starting to get a gradient pattern there, and it's kind of nice the way it disappears off the page. So what, right? So now I have this, what do I do with it? Well, what I would begin to do is start to look at these as extreme conditions. In this case, we're talking about solid void or making gaps. Right, so let's start to look at it in terms of extreme conditions. So in terms of extreme conditions, if we think about this logically, the biggest gap we can have would probably be smaller than the long side of the brick. And the reason for that is that there's a whole brick above it, we don't want it to fall down through. So I'm going to make a rectangle that represents the brick. So just starting, oops, my layer is turned off. Let's switch it to, I haven't created a brick layer. Now is a good time, I guess. New layer, brick, on, nice brickish color. Fine, everything's good. Alright, so start a rectangle, switch it to the brick layer. There we go. Alright, so I know that it's got to be maximum is going to be 230 minus, and I'm going to say 20. So it's going to be, I'm going to go by a dimension and say I want this to be 210. and the height is going to be 76 plus 2 mortars, and I'll show you why that in a second. 96, right? So this is going to be my maximum brick. If I actually draw the size of the brick, and I'll just do it here and base it on a dimension that is 230 by 76. Right, so then I get an idea of the representation. Now, the reason why I went with 96 is because I'm going to assume that I have a 10 millimeter border, and there will be no mortar where the gaps are. So I know that this is my largest hole. Right, so that's going to come somewhere around the center of this gradient, meaning the largest void. So I know it's also then going to start transitioning. So what I might do is start copying a few of these over, and then just changing the size. I mean, if you want it to be nice, you should have it at a nice round number, but I'm trying to do this in a little bit of haste. Right, so we're transitioning from a maximum to a minimum. Now the minimum is going to be, whoops, I don't want to talk about that. The minimum is going to be essentially the 20 millimeter mortar gap. So if you haven't figured out how to make a distance, DI is a distance command. So that's 44. So I can actually, let's do a scale. So I'm going to scale this rectangle from here with a reference. So that reference there, we don't want to do scale. So here's where I'll draw a line. That's 20. It's there. Another command is called the stretch command with an S, and I can hover over. Imagine those blue grips. It's going to move this based on those blue grips. So I can stretch that back to, should have been back to, try this again. I don't want to stretch that line under it, so I got to be careful. There, I want to go to that endpoint. All right, and then delete that. So that's my smallest. Let's do one more in between there. Now, what I'm doing is just creating myself like a library of parts. So I know, and what I might do here is where that brick is draw an extended line horizontal, so I know I'm snapping to the right spots, and just kind of grabbing these, and with the nearest NEA, since I'm going to be using near quite a bit, I might actually come in here and turn it on. Alright. That's good. Now I can start taking these and start spacing them out. And all I'm doing right now, oops, I don't want copies of these, is getting these kind of situated in the gradient, and I'll have to start playing with that dimension there. Is it a single brick? Is it a full stretcher brick? I don't want to cut those, right? So it's probably at the minimum, it's a header brick that I put there. Because we're not cutting bricks in the middle, remember, but this is how I would start to think about this. So if I want to do a header brick, let's just go ahead and do it since we're in the video and we've already taken way too much time. I'm going to go by dimension. That's 110 by 76 there. And what this will do, what I'll have to do down here to help this, is offset my line by 10. I might put that on these on another layer, but I'm trying to rush here. So if I say my minimum distance is that header brick, now I have something to start moving these in relationship to. Right, and I'd put that on a layer where I'll turn it off, or actually just put it on a brick layer. So these become my voids, so I'm actually designing with the voids. Let me turn off the gradient at some point. Here. Alright, so once I have my voids in, I might come back in and let's just use the circle hatch, but we'll turn it on. And I might, if we wanted these to be, like in the video, a solid fill, so we can have a void. Alright, so that's one way I would begin designing the voids into the wall. So I'm actually designing the voids, and then I would come back in, and the void is being designed based on this gradient, and then the voids would then be filled in with the solid, the brick wall. So from these decisions, I can then fill in the bricks as they need to be filled in. Alright, so one last thing I'm going to teach you, which I promised to in the other video, is how to do white on a black background. Alright, so what you actually have to do, and it's this simple, is just come back to the layers, and I can take all of these, instead of full saturation, use what's called invisible ink. Alright, and that essentially prints to white. You guys have it easy. It used to not be this easy. So let me go to a window, go back to here, and what will happen is when I preview this, it'll look completely blank, but you have to trust it. It's actual PDF lines that are there, so I can export this out as a PDF and then import it into InDesign, where I put a black rectangle as a background, and it'll show up there. And this is how I make a lot of my slides, and this is how you can play with the black and white inverted background. So I'm going to stop it there. I hope that gives you enough tools to play. Hopefully it gives you enough insight to how I would begin to think about this. Again, these are tools. Don't copy what I've done, right? This is tools for you to start thinking how you would start thinking through this problem in maybe a different way that starts to think about transitions and gradients, because I'm using a literal gradient to get that gradient, and then thinking about that gradient in terms of scale diminishing from one side to the other. Let me show you one quick trick, sorry. Since this would go from left and be the same going to the right, I can easily mirror this. So there's a command called mirror, MI. I'm going to base it on that center point, and if I turn F8 for ortho on, it'll mirror those objects over. I should have mirrored, won't mirror the hatch because it's all together one hatch. But all you have to do is do one side, mirror the other, and then you have the other one. So I'm going to stop it there because this thing's way too long already.